My own stepfather stood up in that probate courtroom and told the judge I was a pathological liar. He said I'd been making things up since I was 12 years old. He said the will was a fabrication, that I'd written it myself on my dying grandfather's computer, and that I should be barred from inheriting a single nail from that property. I sat there at the respondent's table wearing my grandfather's old wristwatch, and I didn't say one word. The judge was a man named Honorable Frederick Boatwrights, 68 years old, bald on top with the kind of gray mustache that belongs on a marshal in an old western. He'd been on the bench in Hamilton County, Tennessee for 22 years. He let my stepfather finish his speech. He let my mother nod along beside him. Then he set down his pen, looked over his bifocals at the petitioner's table, and said, "Counsel, I want to be very sure I understand what your clients are alleging here. Are they telling this court that they don't know what the respondent does for a living?" My stepfather's attorney, a slick young man in a suit 2 sizes too big, opened his mouth and closed it again. My mother turned her head toward me for the first time in 11 years. Let me back up. My name is Hattie Quillen. I'm 31 years old and I live in Chattanooga, Tennessee. For the last 6 years, I've worked as a forensic document examiner for a private firm called Baymont Analytics. Before that, I worked in the Question Documents Unit at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. What I do, in plain English, is look at pieces of paper and figure out if they're lying. I authenticate signatures. I date inks. I match typewriter impressions. I can tell you whether a will was signed in 2008 or last Tuesday. I've testified as an expert witness in 46 cases across 3 states, and Judge Boatwright happens to be the judge I appeared in front of when a man named Wilbur Pruitt tried to pass off a forged farm deed in 2021. The judge complimented me on the record. He called my methodology, and I'm quoting him here, as careful as anyone I've ever seen step into this courtroom. My mother and stepfather did not know any of this. We've been estranged since I was 20. Here's what you need to know about my mother. Her name is Loretta Quillen Stiles. She left my father, James Quillen, when I was 9 years old. She left him for a man named Royce Stiles, who owned a string of car washes outside Cleveland, Tennessee. My father didn't fight much. He was a quiet man, a high school shop teacher, and he was tired. He died of pancreatic cancer when I was 16. My mother didn't come to the funeral. She sent flowers and a card that said she was thinking of me during this difficult time. I threw the card in the trash on the way to the cemetery, and I never looked back. My grandfather, Earl Quillen, was the one who raised me after Dad got sick. He was a retired locksmith. 63 years old when I moved into his house on Signal Mountain, a little brick rancher with a screened porch and a workshop out back that smelled like oil and brass shavings. Grandpa Earl had hands like baseball mitts and a memory that wouldn't quit. He could tell you which Schlage key blank fit a 1974 Ford Galaxy, and he could also tell you the exact date he met my grandmother, June 12, 1962, at a diner in Knoxville where she was waiting tables to put herself through nursing school. Grandpa Earl taught me everything. He taught me how to read a person by the way they handed you their keys. He taught me that there's no such thing as a small detail. He taught me that when something doesn't feel right, you don't argue with that feeling. You slow down and you look closer. He didn't know he was raising a forensic examiner. He thought he was just raising a granddaughter who happened to be curious about everything. Grandpa Earl died on a Tuesday in February. Heart attack in the workshop. He was 82. The neighbor who came over to borrow a cordless drill found him on the concrete floor, still holding a pin tumbler he'd been picking for fun. I got the call at work and I drove up Signal Mountain in a downpour I barely remember. I sat in his kitchen for 3 hours before I could even bring myself to call the funeral home. He left everything to me. The house, paid off, worth around $20,000. His savings, $94,000 and change. A 2008 Chevy Silverado that didn't owe him a dime. A retirement account with about $41,000 in it. And his workshop, which had been in the family since 1971. Nothing fancy. Just a life carefully built. 4 weeks after the funeral, I got a certified letter from a law firm in Cleveland. My mother and stepfather were contesting the will. According to their petition, the will I had submitted to probate was a forgery. They claimed Grandpa Earl had executed a different will in 2019, leaving his estate to be divided equally among his natural heirs, which according to my mother meant her and her younger sister, my aunt Maybelle, who lived in Florida and had visited my grandfather exactly twice in the last 20 years. They had a copy of this 2019 will attached to their petition. It was a beautiful document. Crisp paper, clean signatures, properly notarized by a man named Otis Greenlee out of Cleveland, Tennessee. It named Loretta Stiles as the executor. It explicitly disinherited me, citing what the document called long-standing behavioral and credibility concerns regarding the granddaughter. I read the whole thing twice sitting at my kitchen table. Then I laughed out loud. I laughed because I knew, the way you know a song after the first 3 notes, that the document was fake. I knew it before I even ran a test. Grandpa Earl had used the same fountain pen since 1998, a Schiefer Targa with a fine nib. He hated ballpoints. He said they bullied the paper. The signature on that 2019 will was made with a roller ball, possibly a Pilot G2. He would have sooner shaved his head than signed his name with a Pilot G2. But laughter doesn't get you anywhere in probate court. You have to do the work. I called my best friend Marlene from law school, who's now a probate attorney in Knoxville. Marlene Bouchard, 43 years old, 2 kids, drinks her coffee black, has a tattoo of a sparrow on her left forearm from her punk rock days. I told her everything. She said 3 things, in order. She said, "Oh, sweetie." She said, "Don't say a word to anyone until I get there." And she said, "Bring me everything you have." Marlene drove down the next morning. We sat in my living room with the so-called 2019 will spread out on my coffee table next to 3 actual documents Grandpa Earl had signed in 2018, 2019, and 2020. Marlene watched me work. I didn't need a microscope to see the problem with the signature. The pen pressure was wrong, the pen lift after the capital E was in the wrong place, and the slant on the lowercase l's was at a different angle than every other authentic sample I'd ever pulled from his files. But the bigger problem was the notary stamp. Otis Greenlee, the notary who supposedly witnessed the signing in November 2019, had surrendered his notary commission in August of that same year after pleading guilty to misdemeanor fraud in Bradley County. He was not legally a notary in November 2019. Anyone who used his stamp after August was committing a felony. Whoever had drafted this fake will had grabbed an old stamp from a man who wasn't checking on his own license status anymore. Sloppy work. But here's the thing. I sat with it overnight before I said anything to Marlene about my real suspicion. Because the thing is, my mother is not clever. She never has been. She's the kind of woman who tells lies that fall apart the second you ask a follow-up question. She doesn't have the patience for fraud. She doesn't have the foresight. Whoever drafted this document had thought about it. Whoever drafted this document had pulled a notary's old stamp, drafted clean legal language, used aging tricks on the paper. The document was lightly yellowed in a way that doesn't happen naturally to printer paper in 5 years. Somebody had baked it under a UV lamp. Royce Stiles, my stepfather, was the one who'd done this. And once I started looking at Royce, I started seeing patterns. His first wife, a woman named Frida, had died in 2011 from complications of pneumonia. She was 51. I never heard much about her, just that she'd been sick. I pulled her obituary from the Cleveland Daily Banner archives online. I found her son, Royce's stepson from that marriage, a man named Calvin Easton who lived in Murfreesboro. I sent him a message through Facebook explaining who I was and what I was looking into. He called me back 40 minutes later. Calvin Easton sounded tired the way people sound tired when something has been sitting on them for years. He told me his mother's estate had been worth about $180,000 when she died. He told me that Royce had been her executor under what he had always assumed was a legitimate will. He told me that by the time everything was settled, the estate had somehow shrunk to $42,000, and Calvin had received exactly $7,000 of it. He told me he'd had questions, but he was 23 years old at the time, and he didn't know any lawyers, and he was grieving and he let it go. He told me he'd regretted letting it go every day since. I asked him if he still had any of the original documents. The will, the inventory of the estate, anything. He had a banker's box in his basement. He'd kept everything. His mother had taught him to keep records. He overnighted the box to me. I won't bore you with everything I found, but I'll tell you the short version. Royce Stiles had been doing this for at least 15 years. He'd done it to his first wife. He'd done it to his own father, who had died of dementia in 2016. And now he was trying to do it to a man he'd never even met. My grandfather? Through a stepdaughter he hadn't seen since she was 20 years old. Before I go further, I want to say this. If you've stayed with me this long, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. If something in this story is resonating with you, if you've ever been told you were the crazy one when you knew you weren't, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let me tell you what happened next. The court date was set for the second Monday in May. That gave me almost 3 months. I did what I do for a living. I built a file. I had Calvin's box. I had every authentic sample of my grandfather's signature I could find, including bank documents going back to 1989. I had affidavits from 2 of Grandpa Earl's longtime customers who had watched him sign things at his workbench using that same Schiefer fountain pen for decades. I had records from the Tennessee Secretary of State's office showing exactly when Otis Greenlee had surrendered his notary commission. I had photographs taken under angled lighting that showed where the paper of the fake will had been artificially aged. I didn't tell my mother's attorney any of this. When he deposed me in April, I gave him absolutely nothing. He asked me what I did for a living. I said I worked in document analysis. He didn't ask which kind. He asked me about my education. I said I had a degree in chemistry from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. He didn't ask what I did with it. He asked me about my relationship with my mother. I said we hadn't spoken in 11 years. He asked me why. I said that was a private matter. He sighed and made a note. He thought I was a frightened woman who was about to lose her inheritance. I let him think that. My mother sat in on the deposition by video. I could see her in the corner of the screen, watching me with that face I remembered from when I was a kid. The face she made when she'd already decided you were lying about something. She thought she had me. She thought I had nothing. 3 weeks before trial, something I did not expect happened. I got a phone call from a woman named Suzette Mauvins. She was 61 years old, a hospice nurse, and she had cared for my grandfather during the last 11 days of his life. I had met her at the funeral, but I didn't know her well. She told me she had something I needed to see. I drove out to her house in Saudi Daisy. She lived in a little ranch with a vegetable garden and 3 cats. She sat me down at her kitchen table and she put a manila folder in front of me. Suzette told me that on the second day she was with Grandpa Earl. He had asked her to bring him a notebook from his bedside table. He'd been weak but lucid, more lucid than people in his condition usually were that close to the end. She said he wrote in that notebook for about 20 minutes every morning for the rest of the time she was with him. He had asked her not to tell anyone. He had asked her when he was gone to make sure I got it. But he had also asked her to wait. He had said, and she quoted him, "Don't give it to her right away. Hattie will figure out plenty on her own. Give it to her when she needs it." Suzette had been keeping an eye on the probate filings. When she saw my mother had contested the will, she decided it was time. The notebook was a small spiral-bound thing, the kind you buy 3 for $1 at the drugstore. The handwriting was shaky in places, steady in others. Grandpa Earl had written down everything he could remember about the conversations he'd had with Royce in the 18 months leading up to his death. I didn't know they had been in contact. I had no idea. According to the notebook, Royce had come to see Grandpa Earl in October 2023. He had introduced himself politely. He had said he was reaching out because Loretta wanted to make amends. He had said they were getting older and they didn't want to die with regrets. Grandpa Earl, who was a kinder man than I'll ever be, had let him in the house. They had talked for an hour. Royce had brought a bottle of bourbon and a coffee cake from a bakery in Cleveland. Royce came back 4 times over the next year. Each visit, he asked questions. Polite questions about Grandpa Earl's estate planning. Grandpa Earl, who was no fool, gave him very little. But Royce did manage to ask whether the will was kept at home or with a lawyer. Grandpa Earl told him it was filed with his attorney, Mr. Holcomb in Chattanooga. Royce nodded and let it go. But then, in May 2024, Royce came over with a folder of papers. He told Grandpa Earl that there had been some concerns raised about my mental health by an unnamed source. He suggested that Grandpa Earl might want to think about whether I was really the right person to inherit a working property, like the workshop. He told Grandpa Earl that he had prepared a draft document just for him to look at, just to think about. No pressure. That would distribute the estate more fairly among family. Grandpa Earl took the document, told Royce he'd think about it, and walked him to the door. He wrote in the notebook that night, and I am paraphrasing because I don't want to misquote my grandfather, that he had spent 50 years picking locks for a living, and he could recognize a man trying to pick him. He never signed anything Royce gave him. but he did make a copy of the draft document Royce had handed him, just so he'd have a record. He folded it and put it in an envelope in the back of his filing cabinet, marked Insurance. I drove home from Suzette's house with the notebook in my lap and the envelope on the seat beside me. I had to pull over twice. The first time because I was crying too hard to see the road. The second time because I had to throw up. When I finally got home, I called Marlene. I told her what I had. She was quiet for a long minute. Then she said, "Hattie, your grandfather just won this case from his grave." The night before the hearing, I drove up Signal Mountain by myself. I parked in front of his house, the one I now owned but hadn't been able to bring myself to move into yet. The porch light was on a timer. I sat in my car for a long time and I talked to him out loud. I told him I was scared. I told him I was angry. I told him I was so proud to be his granddaughter that it actually hurt. I told him that tomorrow, his paper trail was going to do the talking. The morning of the hearing, I wore a charcoal suit and his wristwatch. I got to the courthouse at 8:30. Marlene met me at the doors. We rode the elevator up to the 3rd floor. Probate court, room 304. My mother arrived at 9:15. She wore a navy dress and an expression I remembered from my childhood, the face she put on when she wanted strangers to think she was a kind person. Royce walked behind her in a dark gray suit. He had aged less gracefully than I'd expected. His hair had thinned. His face had hollowed out around the cheekbones. He looked like a man who was already practicing his sad face for the verdict he expected to win. Marlene's old friend, a paralegal named Tisha, sat behind me in the gallery. My boss from Beaumont, a soft-spoken man named Devin Apperly, sat next to her. He had taken the morning off to be there. I hadn't asked him to. Judge Boatwright took the bench at 9:30 sharp. He looked at his file. He looked at the petitioner's table. Then he looked at his file. He looked at the petitioner's table. Then he looked at me. There was a beat, the smallest pause. He didn't say anything. But I saw the slight shift in his expression, the recognition. He'd seen me before. He remembered. He didn't say a word, but he marked it. The petitioner's attorney, the young man in the oversized suit, gave his opening statement. He spoke for about 15 minutes. He talked about a concerned mother and a vulnerable elderly man who had been isolated from his family. He talked about a grasping granddaughter who had inserted herself into her grandfather's life for the sole purpose of inheriting his property. He produced the fake 2019 will as Exhibit A. He produced a sworn affidavit from my mother stating that Grandpa Earl had told her in a phone call in December 2018 that he intended to leave his property to his daughters. A phone call my grandfather, who hated talking on the phone and especially hated talking to my mother, almost certainly never made. Then he gestured to my mother and asked her to address the court. She stood up. She smoothed her dress. She began calmly, talking about her concern for her father's wishes. Then her voice rose, the way it always used to when she felt herself losing an argument, and she pointed at me across the aisle and she said, "And I'm telling you the exact words because I will remember them until I die," she said. "Your Honor, my daughter is a pathological liar. She's been a pathological liar since she was 12 years old. She's been telling stories her entire life, and this will is the biggest one yet. She has manipulated my father, she has forged a document, and she is sitting there right now in a $1,000 suit pretending to be respectable." The suit was off the rack from Belk. It cost $240 on sale. I didn't move. Judge Boatwright let her finish. He waited a moment. Then he turned to her attorney and asked the question I told you about at the beginning. "Counsel, I want to be very sure I understand what your clients are alleging here. Are they telling this court that they don't know what the respondent does for a living?" The young attorney looked at his notes. He looked at my mother. He looked back at the judge. "Your Honor, my understanding is the respondent works in some kind of administrative capacity." Judge Boatwright took off his bifocals. He cleaned them slowly with a handkerchief. He put them back on. "Counsel, the respondent has testified as an expert witness in this courtroom. I have personally heard her testimony in matters involving forged real estate documents. She is, according to her credentials of record, a forensic document examiner." "Did your clients not investigate the very person they have accused of forging a will?" The attorney didn't answer. My mother turned her head and looked at me. She really looked at me. For the first time in 11 years. I didn't smile. I didn't react. I just looked back at her. Marlene stood up. She told the court we had evidence we'd like to enter. She walked it through, piece by piece, the way you teach a child to read. She started with the signature comparison. She presented the authentic samples of my grandfather's handwriting going back to 1989. She brought up the projector. She showed the pen pressure analysis on the screen. Anyone with eyes could see it. Then she presented the notary commission records. The young attorney's face went through several colors in the space of about 30 seconds. Then she presented Calvin Easton's box. The pattern with Royce's first wife. The pattern with his father. She made the point quietly, without drama. She said it would be up to other prosecutors in other counties to decide what to do with that information. She had already, with my permission, sent copies to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. And then, last, she presented Grandpa Earl's notebook. She read 3 pages aloud. She read the part where he described Royce showing up at the bourbon and the coffee cake. She read the part where he described the draft will. She read the part where he wrote, in his own shaky handwriting, that he could recognize a man trying to pick him. The courtroom was quiet. Royce stared at the table. He didn't move. My mother's face had gone the color of skim milk. Judge Boatwright looked at her for a long moment. He asked the petitioner's counsel if his clients wished to be heard further. The attorney whispered to my mother. She whispered back, sharp and fast. He whispered to Royce. Royce shook his head. The attorney stood up and said his clients would like to withdraw the petition. Judge Boatwright said no. He said given the evidence presented, particularly the forged notary stamp, he would be referring this matter to the district attorney for Hamilton County and to the office of the Tennessee Attorney General. He said the will Grandpa Earl had executed in 2017, the real one, the one filed properly with Mr. Holcomb in Chattanooga, was admitted to probate without further contest. He said the petition was denied with prejudice. He looked at me one more time. He gave me the smallest possible nod. It was over in under 2 hours. I want to take a moment here, before I tell you what came after, just to say this. If this story is meaning something to you, if you know someone who lived a version of it, please share it with them. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I read every comment. Now, the aftermath. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation moved on Royce Stiles in late June. Wire fraud, mail fraud, forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The federal charges followed 2 months later after the FBI got involved. Calvin Easton's mother's estate was reopened. Royce's father's estate was reopened. Forensic accountants found something close to $400,000 in unexplained transfers across the 2 estates, going back to 2011. The trial was in March of the following year. I sat through every day of it. Royce was convicted on 11 counts. He got 11 years in federal prison. He'll be eligible for parole in his late 70s. My mother was charged separately for her role in the forged will. Her attorney argued that she had been deceived by her husband. The jury didn't buy it entirely. They convicted her of 1 count of conspiracy and 1 count of perjury for the affidavit she'd signed. She got 4 years. She'll be in her 60s when she gets out. She wrote me a letter from the women's facility in West Tennessee about 6 months into her sentence. I let it sit on my kitchen counter for 2 weeks. Then I asked Marlene to read it for me. Marlene called me afterward and said, in that flat way she gets when she's trying not to be unkind, "Hattie, there is not one true apology in this letter." I didn't write back. The house on Signal Mountain became mine in the legal sense in July. It took me until September to be able to sleep there. I had Marlene and her wife over for dinner the first weekend. We sat on the screened porch and we ate barbecue from a place in Red Bank, and we listened to the cicadas. I cried at one point. Marlene's wife reached over and held my hand without saying anything. I think that's when it started to feel like home. I cleaned out the workshop slowly. I didn't get rid of anything. I just dusted and organized. I kept his fountain pen on the shelf above the workbench. I kept the notebook in a fire safe in the closet. My boyfriend, a man named Westwood Ashby, who I'd been dating for 2 years and who had sat in the gallery at the trial holding a coffee for me that he never got to give me because we weren't allowed to bring liquids in, asked me to marry him in October. He did it at the workshop. He'd been planning it for months. He had asked Grandpa Earl of all the dead and living people on Earth in a letter he'd written and tucked into a drawer in the workbench. He left the letter for me to find on a Saturday morning when I was looking for a Phillips head screwdriver. I said yes. Beaumont gave me a small promotion that November. My first case back at full capacity was a woman in Knoxville whose nephew had moved her into a nursing home and forged a quitclaim deed on her house. We caught him. He got 6 years. People ask me sometimes if I feel bad for my mother. The honest answer is that I feel something, but I don't think it's exactly what they mean. I feel a kind of distant grief for the woman she could have been if she'd chosen differently. I feel something almost like relief that the question of whether I should ever try to reconcile with her has been answered for me by her own choices. I don't feel guilty. My grandfather used to tell me, sitting at his workbench with a key blank in one hand and a file in the other, that the only thing harder than learning a skill is learning to trust yourself with it. He said most people will spend their whole lives waiting for someone else to tell them their work is good. He said don't be one of those people. He said be the one who knows. My mother thought I was small because I was quiet. She thought I was a liar because she was one. She thought my grandfather was a soft old man because she had never bothered to look at him long enough to see anything else. She forgot that he had spent 50 years opening locks. And she forgot that he had taught his granddaughter how to read every single tumbler. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. If it moved you, please leave a comment and let me know. There's another story already up on your screen. I'll see you there. I used to think the worst thing my mother ever did was leave. For years, that was the wound I kept coming back to. The night I was 9 and she walked out the door with 2 suitcases and a man who wasn't my father. But sitting in that courtroom on Signal Mountain's worst day, watching her point at me and call me a liar, I realized something I hadn't let myself see before. Leaving wasn't the worst thing. Coming back to take what wasn't hers, that was the worst thing. And she didn't even come back to me. She came back for a house, a workshop, and $94,000 in a savings account. Every choice she made put her in that chair across from me. Every choice my grandfather made put me in mine. That's the part I want you to sit with for a minute. Royce didn't stumble into being a thief. He practiced. He got better at it with each person he hurt. And Grandpa Earl didn't accidentally raise a forensic document examiner. He sat me down at his workbench when I was 11 and taught me to notice the small things. He let me struggle with a deadbolt for 2 hours one Saturday before he showed me what I was missing. He didn't rescue me from the puzzle. He trusted me to work it out. I think about that a lot now. We become who we practice being. My mother practiced lying for so long she forgot other people could practice the opposite. She forgot that somewhere out there, a quiet girl she'd thrown away had spent a decade learning to read the truth off a sheet of paper. She underestimated me because she never bothered to look. Here's what I want you to take from my story, if you take anything at all. Don't waste your energy trying to convince people who've already decided not to see you. Let them be wrong about you. Let them tell themselves whatever story they need to tell. While they're talking, you keep working. Keep building the skill. Keep keeping the receipts. Keep being the kind of person whose word holds up under a magnifying glass. That's what dignity actually is. It isn't loud. It isn't a comeback. It's the quiet decision, made over and over, to be honest when nobody's grading you on it. And if you're the one who got the bad start, the cold mother, the absent father, the relatives who never showed up, please hear me. The people who raise you don't have to be the people who made you. My grandfather wasn't my parent on paper. He was my parent in every way that mattered. Find your Grandpa Earl, or be one for someone who needs it. The chains don't have to keep going. Somebody breaks them, and then the next generation gets to start clean. Strength isn't shouting back. Strength is staying at the workbench long after the lesson is over, when nobody's watching, because you decided a long time ago that you were going to be ready when it counted.